What is Trump's new term going to look like, and how will it affect China?
The biggest thing that we can expect from Trump 2.0 is uncertainty and chaos.
So is the threat of China really real? And do you think Europe could perhaps benefit from a more cooperative approach?
On economic matters, and this is true not just in Europe, it's true across the globe. Chinese economy is both a massive opportunity and a competitive threat. So it's very important to be specific. A smart deployment of tariffs can get American industry back. But that requires a smart application rather than across-the-board application of tariffs. I do believe that China today is at a point where it really has to choose between Russia and its own economic future.
In today's episode, we had Yasheng Huang, a prominent economist at MIT University, who's an expert on China and its economic growth, which is what we talked about today.
Mostly known for his book, The Rise and Fall of the East and Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics. We had an exhilarating talk and I highly encourage you guys to check it out.
Yeah. Enjoy and like and subscribe if you like what we're doing. And see you soon.
The Inspire Us podcast.
Thank you very much.
Actually, I didn't get your name.
So Alex.
Dara.
Okay,
Yeah.
Alex and Dara.
So we met briefly at
I know,
talk.
but I just didn't get your name.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So, and actually at your talk, it was a talk on rethinking China's economic growth or growth model. And you briefly mentioned Trump 2.0, and we didn't get around to it, but I wanted to know a little bit, how do you think Trump's is going to, what is Trump's new term going to look like, and how will it affect China?
Yeah, so the biggest thing that we can expect from Trump 2.0 is uncertainty and chaos. Other than that, we cannot really say much about what he is going to do. And I think it is quite certain, given the cabinet appointments that he has nominated, there are going to be people who are extremely hawkish on China, but he himself has sent mixed messages. So we just don't know where the policy program is going to be, because there are conflicting messages coming from his appointees and from himself. Unlike Biden administration, when he came into power in 2021, he was very clear about his policy on China, and his Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, Treasury Secretary, they were all on the same page. Right? So that's the big difference between Trump 2.0 and the Biden administration. But the other thing I'm willing to make a prediction of is that Trump is going to undermine the professionalism and the expertise of American government. And he's going to try to undermine democracy as well. So these efforts, he may not be successful, but he is going to make those efforts. These efforts are going to boost the reputation and the prestige of autocratic regimes such as Russia and China. So the relative standing of the United States in the next 4 years is going to decline.
So it does seem that Trump has quite a adverse stance on China. Like China, is stealing American jobs, and he mentions a lot tariffs. We're going to, tax everything.
But also, what about his administration or things he said that makes you think he's kind of mixed on China?
Yeah.
Because I think for most people, he's the most anti-China president perhaps we've had in recent times. So what makes you...
Yeah, so that's a very good question. We know that Trump is an admirer of autocrats.
So you think he admires autocrats?
He does.
Okay.
Oh, openly. and loudly. He admires Putin. He admires Xi Jinping. So yes, he has attacked China as a country, but he has praised the Chinese leader and the Russian leader, right? So that's a very different way that we usually think about relationship between China and the United States, because if you have a very hawkish view on the country, you tend to have a hawkish view on the leader that presides over that country. And whereas Trump has a split personality on that particular issue. The other feature of Trump is that he is a very transactional politician. So he believes that he can do transactions with autocrats. He tried to do that during his first administration with North Korea. He didn't succeed. He didn't go anywhere, but he did. And this time around, you can imagine that he can do a transactional foreign policy vis-a-vis China, aiming not so much at the country, but aiming at getting a deal from the Chinese leader.
So you think all this talks of 60% tariffs, it's really because he has an ulterior motive. You don't actually think he's going to pursue such protectionist policies?
No, he does believe in protectionism, and he has been very consistent on that point of view, going back to the 1980s when he criticized Japan. But now he's the president, so he may very well use tariff as a bargaining chip with Canada, with Mexico, with EU, with China, right? So it is not an ideological belief. But on the other hand, he clearly doesn't have an ideological faith in free trade either.
Do you think that's a positive thing for America, that he's going to impose all these tariffs, or do you think this will hurt America?
It's going to be disastrous. If he does go ahead with the tariff levels that he was talking about, 60% on Chinese goods, and tariffs on EU, on Canada, on Mexico. I don't see, just as a transactional matter, I actually don't see the logic with the way that he goes about his tariff policy. If I were the US president, and then I try to fundamentally change the relationship between China and the United States, I would impose high tariffs on China and lower tariffs on other countries, right? Such as from ASEAN countries, such as from EU, such as from Mexico and Canada. Because what you want to do is you want to motivate and create a momentum for Chinese manufacturing production to leave that country to go to another country that can export to the United States. And the other element of the irrationality of his plan is that if you impose tariffs on all the countries, then China still has a competitive advantage because China has a very low cost base. They are very competitive in certain products. And if you raise tariffs on me, but also on my competitors, I still have that cost advantage, right? So it's a very stupid idea on his part.
There's another element of this is that BYD, the electric vehicle company in China, they're also starting to set up factories in Brazil, Mexico, Thailand. So essentially, China are sort of circumventing this kind of protectionist policy from Trump.
Yeah, so circumventing is one way to put it. But if that view is very widespread, which is that somehow it is like a master plan on the part of China to... Definitely there is that. I'm not saying there's not that motivation. But what's really important in terms of economic activities is where employment is created, where the income is generated, where the revenue is generated. If these manufacturing operations move away from China, they also take away income generating and employment generating opportunities for Chinese workers, for Chinese banks and capital providers. So yes, you do this to evade the tariff, but in the long run, it is going to have a drag effect on Chinese economy.
It's almost as if Trump has such confidence in the American buying power and the consumers that he just believes, you know what, you guys care about us, and I'm just going to use that power to negotiate whatever I want.
And I think what's also quite interesting is a lot of political commentators, they kind of see tariffs as also or somewhat being conducive to America getting the industry back, when I don't think necessarily that is the case.
So it's very important to be specific. A smart deployment of tariffs can get American industry back. But that requires a smart application rather than across-the-board application of tariffs. As I said before, what you want to do is you want to impose tariffs on Chinese goods, but you want to lower tariffs on Mexican goods, or maybe Brazilian goods, or maybe Canadian goods, so that those countries can supply to you the components that go into the production of the products that you protect yourself against China, right? So when you sort of have this universal application of tariffs, that purpose is defeated. The other thing is that it requires other policies as well. Requires government investments in research and development. It requires government spending on training of the workers. It requires reforms of the regulatory system. And it requires an open border on both immigration and on capital. This is where Trump's policy is counterproductive. You want to actually have manufacturing created in America. It's not enough just to prevent Chinese goods from coming in. You also want to lower the cost of production in the United States. And one of the things you want to do is to lower the labor costs. If you are kicking out immigrants from your country, you're raising the production costs and labor costs of manufacturing, right? Also, America is not going to go back to produce T-shirts and socks and shirts. America is going to launch advanced manufacturing. And advanced manufacturing requires government support of research and development, government support for technology. And he is cutting spending by the government on science and technology.
I was wondering, because you mentioned BYD, and I know currently there's almost, I think, tens of thousands of electric cars that are waiting in European ports. You know, the EU doesn't want to let them in. And I wanted to ask, how does China see Europe? Are they seen as just like a market? Are they seen as friends? Do they want to get closer to Europe? Or are they enemies?
Well, definitely China sees Europe as a market, and the importance of Europe as a market has increased. Precisely, China now has very difficult relationship with the United States. If Trump does allow Chinese products to come in, that calculation may change, right? the problem with the Chinese thinking on this is that on the economic side, they see Europe as a market and more important market. On the geopolitical side, they're supporting Russia, right? So how can you have such a split in your economic and geopolitical policies when Russia is invading Ukraine, conducting an active war on the border of Western Europe? So they have to realize that there's a massive inconsistency between its economic motivations and its geopolitical policy.
That's very interesting, because I was reading this Financial Times article the other day, and they were mentioning how the EU sort of want to do this technology transfer.
Yeah.
So China's that essentially have Chinese companies, transfer some technology, and then the EU would subsidize battery production. Yeah. And then I was just thinking, do you think China is actually a threat? Do you think the threat of China is perhaps overstated, especially from a European perspective? Because clearly there's some benefits of aligning with China, and especially Starmer in the UK as well. He's kind of he's sort of pressured to deviate away from China, but there's a large part of him and in pursuing UK's interest to also side with China. So is the threat of China really real? And do you think Europe could perhaps benefit from a more cooperative approach?
On economic matters, and this is true not just in Europe, it's true across the globe. Chinese economy is both a massive opportunity and a competitive threat. That's always true. And it's not just true of China, it's true of Japan, Germany. And so, except that China is much bigger than those countries, and Chinese capabilities are quite wide-ranged, right, from advanced manufacturing to also low-tech manufacturing. So these are the differences between China and these other economies that are more uniform in terms of their product offering. Like, look at Germany, right? So it is a opportunity, but that opportunity is only achievable if you have a degree of level playing field, right? And so the European countries have so far been more interested in getting into the Chinese markets by producing there. Look at Germany. Germany has many automobile factories in China. Volkswagen, Audi, Mercedes. And they, for years and years, they were doing extremely well, right? French companies, so I'm not as familiar with British companies. French companies, nuclear power plant, they were doing extremely well. American companies, GE, GM, they were also doing very well. The Western economies have not been as successful in exporting to China. And that implies a differential economic consequences. When the Chinese economy is very strong, you can benefit from the rise of the Chinese economy by producing in China. But now Chinese economy is slowing down. The Chinese companies are increasingly eager to export because the domestic market is not growing as strongly. So now you have a competition now in a way that we didn't have before. So I think this is the fundamental dilemma facing European economies more than facing American economy.
It's almost as if it's a little bit too late. So as you mentioned, you had all these European companies that, were almost greedy. They went there, they gave their technologies, they were looking at the profits. And now they're surpassed, even in like talking about electric cars. China has very high capabilities, and now Europe is looking like they're a step behind.
So I think I think you stated the issue very, very correctly and clearly. The question is, what is the takeaway? What is the diagnostics of the reasons why Europe has ended, is in the current situation it is in? You definitely, so what, I'm more familiar with German cars and German companies. What Germany did was that it used the Chinese market to extend the life of traditional automotive technology, gasoline-driven car. They found a huge market in China. Rather than transitioning to EVs, right? So suppose that, and also Germany actually has made two incredibly bad mistakes. One was to bet on Russia as a source of energy supply, cheap energy, right? And the other bet was betting on the Chinese market, absorbing the gasoline traditional automobile car production. At one point it worked. You have cheap energy, and then you have a incredible market to sell into that market. But over the longer run, the problem was that this addiction to traditional industries is coming back to haunt them. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, it is more about the European entrepreneurial ecosystem rather than placing the wrong bets. Because even when you place wrong bets, if you have very strong entrepreneurs, you can still have new industries coming from entrepreneurial startups. This is where Europe has failed, right? So if you look at the United States, it wasn't Ford, it wasn't GM that created EVs. It was Tesla, right? It was a company that nobody heard of maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago. I don't remember when Tesla was created. If you look at Ford and GM, those companies, they made exactly the same mistake as Audi, Volkswagen, and Mercedes. They extended the lifeline of their traditional car models in China as well as within the United States. But you had Elon Musk, who came along to challenge that model. And you had US government supporting, at that time, Elon Musk. And you have American venture capital industry supporting Tesla. And Tesla succeeded. China, BYD. BYD was a new company, was an entrepreneurial company. It was not the traditional car companies in China that made the transition from traditional cars to EVs. It requires a new player, able and willing to challenge existing players. And Europe, as far as I know, and Germany in particular, never had that. That was the problem. So you can't quite blame everything on Russia or on China.
It's interesting as well because I think a lot gets talked about Western strategy and them they're essentially starting a trade war. But What do you think China's retaliation will be? Like, can China get the upper hand if a trade war is started?
Yeah, so I think compared with 2016 when China retaliated, or 2018, I should say, against the tariff war started by Trump 1.0, China then had more economic capital to counteract against Trump. The domestic economy, even though it was beginning to slow down, it was still fairly strong. So you had the economic resources and strength to counteract against the United States. This time around, it's going to be much more difficult. It's much more difficult because not only do you have the United States, you may also have Europe. Right? Last time around, Europe, when Trump came into power, there was a backlash from European countries against Trump. And many European countries actually looked to China as a counterweight against the Trump administration. But this time around, if your policy is supporting Russia, which is actively invading Ukraine, even if there are economic benefits from expanding ties with China, it is unlikely that you're going to go forward with it, right? So Europe is also thinking about imposing tariff on Chinese products. And even some developing countries are also thinking about imposing tariffs. So China, this time around, is facing global backlash, not just backlash against, from one country. And the other big difference is that the Chinese economic situation today, domestic economy, is entirely different from the situation in 2018. Much weaker. The domestic consumer sentiment is very negative. The real estate market is extremely problematic. The debt level is very, very high. So it's just a totally different situation.
I wanted to ask you about the global South countries imposing tariffs on China.
Yeah.
Because for me, isn't that completely counterintuitive? I mean, what is the reason or behind this? It's not necessarily in their interests.
Yeah, so it depends on, again, how you do it. And some of these countries want to jumpstart their own EV industry. So usually the way to look at that policy is to see if they increase the tariffs, but decrease the barriers against Chinese investments. What you want to do is you want to protect the market, but you want to make it economically attractive to Chinese producers to build factories in your own country. Only very few countries can do that. If you're a big country like Brazil, maybe you can do it. India, maybe you can do it. But definitely it doesn't make any sense. So I've read that even Indonesia wants to do that. I'm not sure Indonesia really has the capability to do something like that. And so, so it depends on whether or not you have the potential capability to produce EVs, and whether or not you are attractive enough for Chinese producers to come into your country.
But I think even regarding Europe, this aspect you mentioned of geopolitical ties is very important. And I think it really started to be important with COVID.
Yeah.
But now even I know China and Russia have a military deal. And so looking at now with Russia and Europe are almost at war, Europe might play a political point and say, hey, we're going to, also attack China, economically. Do you think China is seeing this and would want to distance themselves from Russia because their economy is not doing as well?
Well, I hope so. I just think that on economic considerations, there's zero upside from supporting Russia. And Russia has a small economy and failing economy now. Russia's economy is in a terrible shape. And so its market is not growing. It is only going to decline. And the size of the market is peanuts compared with the size of the market in Europe and in America, Japan, right? Advanced economies. On economic considerations, there's not a single reason why China should support Russia. It is hurting the economic interests of China. It is hurting the relationship between China and the United States and relationship with Europe, right? So I think the easy way for China now and the quickest way for China now is to distance itself from Russia in a very big way, not incrementally. I think there has been some small changes, but it's not that clear. It's the signal is mixed, to be honest. It's very reluctant. I mean, Russia is a invading country violating the sovereignty of another independent state. And there's no rationale for supporting Russia whatsoever.
True.
Plus, committing war crimes and all these atrocious destruction of people in Ukraine. Morally, how can you support a country like that?
And I mean, if there was going to be a change with China in regards to Russia, it would be probably now, because we all know that China experienced unprecedented growth, but now it arrives at a point where China is the second biggest economy in the world.
Yeah.
It's a massive powerhouse. And in your talk the other day, you were talking about that China needs to rethink their growth model. And you mentioned that they have a focus on technology and less so a focus on personal income. And maybe you can talk about it more, but it's a very interesting debate, right? Do you focus on having, low personal income so your industries are more competitive and you have bigger exports, which will grow the industry? Or do you have higher income and you'll have more domestic product, which will grow the economy? Yeah. So how do you think, what should China do and what is the state?
So let me get to the first part of your question first, and then I'll come to this distinction between economic growth and technology. I do believe that China today is at a point where it really has to choose between Russia and its own economic future. As you pointed out, Chinese economy is slowing down. They need export markets much, much more. If Trump imposes tariffs, they need the European market even more. So that's one consideration that they really should take into account. The other is that Russia is failing as an economy. So the relative attractiveness of Europe relative to Russia as an economic market, as a commercial market, is increasing, right? Europe becomes more attractive. America becomes more attractive at the time when Russian economy is experiencing difficulties. I believe that European market and American market have always been far more attractive than the Russian market. But if the Russian market, even though the level is low, but if it is growing at a higher rate, you can justify going to Russia. Having said that, I also believe that you actually don't need to support Russia's policy on Ukraine in order to benefit from Russian economy, right? So China in many ways could have played a neutral and constructive role in mediating between Ukraine and Russia. That was my hope 2 years ago when the war just happened. I actually wrote an article in Project Syndicate making that argument. Right? But clearly, it didn't happen. On your second part of the question between economy and technology, here's what I'm willing to say. China is a big country, 1.4 billion people. And also China has very different economic conditions between different provinces, between different regions of the country. It's almost like China is a collection of many, many different countries. A little bit like the United States. United States also has very different economic conditions. So China can do both. China can develop technology. China has some really good universities. They can do advanced scientific research. But China also has some backward regions that can also do low-tech production, low-tech services that promote employment, not so much technology. They can do that without any contradiction. So I'm not arguing against technology. I'm arguing against a national policy that everybody has to do technology, right? And this is what's happening in China now. Even some of the most backward regions are not doing low-tech production. They want to subsidize EVs and all these high-tech computing, AI. Everybody is doing that. That, to me, is a wrong direction.
But it's very interesting because in your talk, you actually mentioned that everyone sees the success of China being attributed to technology and infrastructure, whereas you highlight that, no, economic growth came first, and as a product, technology and infrastructure spurred out of it. And that's a common misconception.
Yeah, that's right. So if you look at the history of Chinese economic growth in the last 40, 45 years, economic growth happened first as a result of the country embracing market economy, globalization, and embracing low-tech manufacturing. Right? In the United States, I'm not sure about Europe, but in the United States, we're very familiar with what is known as made in China. Right? So almost everything is made in China. Shirts and shoes and all of that. It was that development that powered the GDP growth. Then the GDP growth generated resources, and then the resources have been used to promote technology and infrastructure. My critique is twofold. One is that we shouldn't lose the sight that China, as I pointed out before, is a diverse country. Right? Some regions do high tech, other regions should do low tech. And according to their comparative advantages, and you cannot recreate a Silicon Valley everywhere. The United States definitely didn't do that. No other country has like multiple Silicon Valleys. And the other critique that I have is that because they want to do this supply side technology, they believe that the money, the resources, the bank credits, the capital that go to small-scale production, low-tech services are a waste of money. Right? So there are restrictions on doing these activities rather than allowing 100 flowers bloom, right? And each region has its own production capabilities in different tiers of the products, right? So that's a policy that I object to. I'm not against technology. I'm not against infrastructure. I guess my third critique is they're overdoing it. Right? So look at infrastructure. And bridges are built to go nowhere. If you go to the airports in China now, many airports are empty. And high-speed rails, only a few of them make money. Many of them are losing money. So the scale of the investments are not justified by economic returns.
Yeah. And also I wanted to highlight, how much do you attribute to, not the downfall of China, but all the issues China are facing today? How much of that do you attribute to Xi Jinping? Because I have a mate who's also from China, and one of his main concerns is that, and also that you mentioned in your talk, is that Xi Jinping is kind of centralizing power increasingly. He's stifling the private sector, and he goes against everything Deng Xiaoping implemented in liberating politically China's economic landscape. And this gets lost, I think, in the discussion, is perhaps a lot of this is attributed to Xi Jinping. But I just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
No, I agree with your friend. And I do believe that the centralization he has created and the concentration of power in one person have created many of these problems and have made it difficult to correct these problems. I actually view the second problem as a more severe problem. So you persist in mistakes. You persist in mistaken policies far longer than you should. And maybe you never correct the policy mistakes. But I wouldn't go so far as to say everything was created by him. In terms of, we can go back even earlier to the 1990s, but let me not go that far. But let's go back to 2008. I think in 2008, China made a pivot toward infrastructure, capital-intensive growth, and industrial policy program. That pivot laid down the seeds of the problems that Xi Jinping inherited back in 2012, and he didn't correct them. He actually amplified some of the problems created by that policy pivot in 2008. So that's one. And the other is that he has re-centralized decision-making, political structure, political decision-making. Now it is very difficult to reverse those decisions without having some political repercussions, right? I mean, it is also true that he has reversed some decisions, such as COVID control. But the difference between COVID control and the economic policy program is COVID control is a very specific program, specific action. Economic policy program is much broader. You essentially have to make a lot of changes in order to make meaningful changes in the economic policy program. In fact, we have already seen some evidence that he is now making some changes in the economic program, such as stock market, real estate, and for example, if you look at the recent policies on visa, he has relaxed visa requirements. So, but these are small things and more symbolic than substantive, and they are not really viewed as credible by foreign governments, by foreign investors, nor by domestic private sector, because the policy damage that he has created requires far bigger changes than doing these simple, small step adjustments.
Right. But this idea of talking about whether a democracy or authoritarian regime is better for economic growth is interesting because, I don't think a democracy is a concept that will lead to economic growth. I think it's more of a result of a certain amount of wealth. And it can even be argued that, under dictatorships, you can control things more, maybe in a positive direction, looking at Korea in the 60s. And, Ghana now is basically a democracy, but that doesn't mean they're going to become an economic powerhouse. I think when you have a dictatorship, there tends to be a lot more inequality in wealth distribution. And this is why the French Revolution happened. France became rich, but eventually the people had enough and revolution happened and a democracy was created. I want to ask you, China is becoming more and more wealthy, and maybe we can end on this. How do you think this regime can last long? Do you think, what's next for China? Can they continue under this system?
So there are a couple of points I think are important to convey to your viewers or listeners of your podcast. One is that you mentioned Korea, but you failed to mention which Korea. Right? It was South Korea, not North Korea.
Right.
And then the follow-up question on that is, of these two Koreas, which one was more autocratic? It was North Korea. That was far more autocratic than South Korea. And yet, North Korea didn't grow. South Korea did. Taiwan and China under Mao. Taiwan was autocratic. China under Mao was also autocratic. The next question is, which one was more autocratic? It was China under Mao that was more autocratic. And yet, it was the less autocratic Taiwan that grew to be a very strong economy. It is very important to pay attention to nuances, right? This idea that dictatorship is good for economic growth or democracy is good for economic growth. These are statements at a very high general level. We need to go down to the next level to talk about what kind of dictatorships we're talking about, what kind of democracies we're talking about, right? In order to think about the implications for economic growth. I can say in terms of statistical evidence, there's no support for the idea that autocracies are good for economic growth. Statistical evidence. The reason is very simple. There are some autocracies that are very strong in terms of economic growth, like Deng Xiaoping's China. But there are also autocracies that are total failures. Right? North Korea, for example, and quite a few African countries in the 1960s and 1970s. The Philippines under Marcos was an autocracy. It didn't grow. Right? So essentially, statistically speaking, the successes of the autocracies are completely wiped out by the failures of the autocracies. So in terms of the statistical effect, it's actually precisely zero. In terms of democracies, the evidence is not as clear-cut one way or the other, but some recent research, for example, one by the recent Nobel Prize winner, Daron Acemoglu, shows that, and this is carefully done research, controlling for many, many conditions. When you reverse a country's political system from autocracy to democracy, from democracy to autocracy, you do see a big impact on the economy. When a country becomes from autocracy to democracy, the level of public services, education, public health goes up. When the country goes from democracy to autocracy, the level of public services goes down. I believe in that line of research much more than other research that has a very, very high level comparisons, right? So, China with India and Russia with whatever. So, because this is a much more controlled study. In terms of your question about the future of China, I agree that economic growth does not automatically lead to political openness. But I can also say with high degree of confidence that economic development, true economic development, not just superficial GDP growth, does not hurt political openness. It's not deterministic. Nothing is in real life. In our personal life, in economic life and social life of real societies, of real human beings, nothing is deterministic. This is not physics. This is not chemistry. This is just social science, political science, and economics. Nothing is deterministic. The issue is general tendency, statistical general tendency. And one thing we know for a fact is that the most advanced countries, the richest countries in the world, every single one of them is a democracy, except for few oil-producing countries, right? So that's a pretty clear pattern. For China specifically, I believe that if the economic growth and economic development has generated changes in the values of the people, changes in the values of the intellectual, economic, and political elites, that kind of growth is more likely to lead to a democracy as compared with the economic changes that don't really come with value changes, right? So economic changes are a distant variable. Political change is at this side of the equation. You need something in between to transfer the effect of the economic changes to the political changes. And I would argue that in my lecture, I didn't go into that. I would argue that the kind of growth that China has generated since the early 1990s has not been associated with the degree of value changes that are more likely to be associated with a political change, because it's a state-controlled growth. It is massive investments rather than market-driven, rather than coming from the bottom. On the other hand, in the last 30 years and before Xi Jinping, China did embrace globalization. So you have, values coming from the outside. Those may be conducive to economic and political changes. But the thing about those is that those values are isolated and they are concentrated in a few urban areas, right? Shanghai, Shenzhen, and concentrated among a few intellectual elites rather than widespread. So I'm not surprised that the economic changes so far have not translated into political changes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Hang. And if anyone, I encourage anyone to check out his book. It came out last year, The Rise and Fall of the East. Yeah. And it was an absolute privilege to be able to speak to you today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.